So I was in my third year of my PhD program, and I was writing my papers for my comps exams, and I took out a book from the UMass library called Writing Literature Reviews, a guide for something something for the social and behavioral sciences. Very good book. The author's name is Galvan. So if you are interested in writing a literature review, it's a good step-by-step guide for how to do a literature review for papers or for journals. But anyways, I borrowed this book. I reserved it through the website. Went to the circulation desk to pick it up. The person behind the desk got it, read the title, and was interested. Said, "Would this be useful for me?" And I said, "Yeah, probably if you are in the social sciences." And she went she talked for 30 seconds about how she was in comparative literature and wanted to do a paper about comparing text for literary value. I guess taking two of the great books and doing comparisons on them. I'm not familiar with comp lit, but it does uh, during that interaction, it occurred to me, yeah, she's not talking about literature in the same way that I look at literature in my field. So we're looking at the same word, we hear the same word, but there's different meanings that we attach to that word owing to our separate references that our knowledge that we have, which brings up today's topic of the signifier and the signified. So, and this is clear in literature, or anyone who's tried to teach literature to English language learners knows about the challenges. Teaching grammar and vocabulary is a challenge enough, but how do you teach learners about the meaning underneath the words on the page or the words that we're speaking? And I thought I had it figured out for one class that I had with high level learners. A good portion of these students were returnees. They might have studied abroad, come back. They're really good at English. Their TOEIC scores really prove it. And I said, okay, I'm going to do a quick mini lesson at the beginning of the semester before we get into reading these books that I want them to read throughout the semester. So then we could do a real discussion class and do a whole literary thing. It'll be just like my 10th grade English class. So the first 2 weeks was dedicated to teaching them Billy Joel. I picked Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, which is a story song, and there's a lot of detail in there, enough to tell a story about Brenda and Eddie, two people who fell in love young. They got married, they had the married life, and they fought, they divorced, and that's it. And the whole meaning of it is that not every story has a good ending, right? Not everybody falls in love and lives happily ever after. At least that's how I understand the song. Plus, it's really catchy, isn't it? And and the students got into it for the two lessons that we had, just to break down the story into parts, kind of call it chapters, if you will, and what's happening in this chapter, what's happening in that chapter, etc. Who are the characters? What are they doing with each other? What are they saying to each other? And what's the overall flow of the story? So to a certain degree, they understood it, and they understood the words, the lyrics of it. Of course, it was on the page; it wasn't just sung. When you see something written down, it's easy to understand, or easier rather. Um, but there's a deeper meaning that I feel maybe my students didn't readily get. So one of the verses after Brenda and Eddie get married, they bought an apartment with deep pile carpet and a couple of paintings from Sears. And to people who grew up in America and who've watched sitcoms from the 70s, you know that the deep pile carpet, the paintings from Sears, they are all artifacts of the middle class life, something that is comfortable and living the American dream and has all the trappings of modernity, etc., etc. If you are a language learner, maybe you're not understanding that. You might understand each specific word and the meaning that is attached to each word, but are you really understanding the cultural reference that goes behind it? That when you hear the words paintings from Sears, then it's a sign of comfort. It's a sign of middle class modernity. And that's probably a deeper thing that we didn't have time to get into, but we'll call it a missed opportunity on my part. Which brings us to a Swiss linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure. I am probably butchering that name, but I hope I'm in the ballpark, which is another cultural reference, by the way. He is a linguist who talked about signs and signifiers and the signified. And what exactly does that mean? So, and this is my brief interpretation. You remember this from the last video. So the signifier for this is the sound cell phone or mobile phone or smartphone or Google Pixel. So the sound of it is the signifier. The signified is what does it mean? Now, of course, there's a surface level understanding of what it means. It is a thing that you use to make telephone calls or send email or play games or the hundred of other things that a smartphone can do these days. So that might be the utility that I attach to this concept, to this thing. But there's other things, right? It's expensive, which means that if I have a smartphone, it's a sign of my status, that I have a job and I can pay for it. It is a sign of, of convenience. If I lose it, then I'm really inconvenienced, that I'm really put out. But all of this deeper meaning may not be in the dictionary. It might be in a Wikipedia article, but even that might miss some of the things that are attached to an understanding of what a smartphone is. And just like in the last video, if I call this a smartphone and you call this a duck, then we might be talking past each other because we're not aligned with each other, because our understanding of the signifier is going to be different. This video talks about how we talk past each other because what we understand to be signified is different. So if I were to take this thing, a can of Parmesan cheese, I had it on me because I'm eating dinner and all, but green can stuff, definitely not the real thing. It's processed, it's cheap, it's all that stuff. So if you've grown up in America, then you probably have a negative connotation attached to this thing as being cheap and not pure, as it were. But I lived here in Japan for a long time, and I remember a time when cheese was expensive to get. It was hard to get because it was rare. You couldn't find it. And a lot of the things that were called cheese at the supermarket, they were the processed stuff, and I swear they never melted in the toaster oven. I would see the toast burn, but the slices of cheese would not dissolve or melt, which tells me about how processed things were. But if you were homesick and Japanese food was not your thing for the night, and you wanted some spaghetti and tomato sauce, and so having the green can, at least for me, reminded me of, my childhood, or some flavor of America that I could not get easily um, away from home. So my understanding of what I attach to this is bound to be different than what you attached to this, depending on all the circumstances and all the knowledge that you have, and that you might bring to understanding the sign. So cultural reference plays a big deal in language, spoken language rather. If you've ever watched The West Wing, and it's laden with cultural references, both pop culture and high culture, because they're trying to show that the characters are erudite and they know so much stuff, knows so much more than the average person. Billions does it in a different way, the TV show on Showtime. They do it. They do a lot of pop culture references, but also, yes, to show off knowledge, but also to, at certain points in dialogue, to make a point. So the line that I remember from, that I reference a lot when I talk about Billions, next to last episode in the second season, because that was a memorable episode, is where at the beginning Bobby Axelrod uses the phrase "sunny on the causeway," to signify that someone is holding out on bad news or disappointing news. Now, that's a reference to The Godfather, both the novel and the movie, where Sonny Corleone is killed on the causeway by a rival family. And that is supposed to be one of the major plot points in the story of The Godfather. So when Bobby Axelrod uses that reference, he could say the words, are you holding back on bad news? But that's not as dramatic. That's not as poetic as using a reference from The Godfather. But here's the problem. You may understand each word that Bobby Axelrod is saying. Sunny, that sounds like a person's name. Causeway, that's a road that cars drive over. But if you don't understand that cultural reference, it doesn't mean anything. And it'll go over your head and you won't understand it because you are not aligned with the writers in terms of the meaning, the cultural reference that's being conveyed. And that's the whole point of Saussurean semiotics, that spoken language is not like a computer language. It's not like C++, where if I feed a computer 10 lines of code and I run that program 100 times on the same computer, the result is going to happen, the same result is going to happen 100 times. If the result's different, then it's probably the computer's fault. There's something wrong with it somehow. And spoken language is not like that, in that it's not a mechanical thing. There is a more, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but there is a creative aspect to the language that we use when we interact with each other. And it's very important to understand that when our students don't understand what we're trying to say, again, it's not because they're dumb or slow or lazy. It might be, and there's many possible reasons, many good reasons, but one possible reason is that they might not understand the meaning that we are attaching to our words. And I've seen teachers in class, quote Game of Thrones, or back in the early 2000s, it was The Sopranos, or The Simpsons, or maybe not quote them, but use the characters' voices as if to the students that meant something meaningful. And when it doesn't, it falls flat. and there's reasons that it falls flat that may not be that there's something wrong with the students. There may be something in the way that we present the meaning to those students that might be causing the breakdown in communication. Um, so in English language teaching, you will see this practice a lot with graded readers. Now, graded readers are simplified texts. They might be simplified from Great Expectations or Romeo and Juliet. The words are shorter. They are more commonly found in everyday language rather than jargon. The grammar, the sentences are broken up into smaller chunks, so it's easier for students to understand. And that's important. Simplifying the signifier is important in language teaching because the simpler you make stuff, the easier it is for someone to understand. Even outside the classroom, if someone's talking to me in sentences that are 60 words long, I'm gonna tune out, or I'm just not gonna understand. So it's very important to break down the language in a way that the people who are listening to us might have the best chance of understanding what we mean. And thus, it's our responsibility as a teacher to establish alignment, but not just in terms of the signifier, but in terms of the signified. So I remember teaching in high school in Tokyo, a graded reader version of Oliver Twist. This thin, 10 chapters long. I think the real version is close to 40 chapters, at least, but it's a big number. Charles Dickens loves lots of chapters. We English teachers shortened it into more manageable chunks for language learners to understand. And it worked. And during the semester, it took one semester to read it with the class, and they understood the story, they understood the interplay between the characters, the development of the characters, what happens at the end, and so on. But of course, they might be missing the real depth of the story of Oliver Twist, because it's important to ask ourselves, to what extent do students understand the context of Victorian England and how bleak everyday life is supposed to be, especially when you are an orphan, when you're dirt poor, and eventually you're on the streets, and not that it's a picnic today, but life back in Victorian England must have been on the streets of Victorian England must have been magnitudes more bleak than it might have been today. So do students really, to what extent do students understand the depth of the importance of the setting? Do they understand the commentary that Charles Dickens is trying to convey in telling the story? And do they understand the context, his life context, his circumstances that interpret, that filter the story that he is trying to tell? And all of that contributes to the deeper themes and analysis and message of the story of Oliver Twist. That if you don't have a full appreciation of all of those things, you may not be able to really grasp the full depth of the story. But the point is, it is not necessarily because of a shortcoming in understanding the language, the words or the grammar structures that are attached on the text, but it might be about the knowledge that is trying to be conveyed. And so it's important that for teachers, when we look at a text that we are going to give to students, we look at the text deeply and try to understand or try to grasp what are the assumptions and references within the text that the writer assumes students must know. There's a lot of bad examples of English textbooks that assume a lot of background knowledge that maybe Americans or British people or Australians might take for granted because we're familiar with the culture, but our students may not, and they might have what we call comprehension problems, but not because they don't understand the words or the grammar. So it's really important for us to really deeply analyze the text that we're about to give our students and say, what knowledge should we be presenting them first? What cultural reference should we be presenting first before we give them the text and leave them to their own devices? And this is not just a language teaching thing either. It applies to everyone in any social interaction. That if we are to have productive, meaningful interactions with each other, it's really important to understand the other's point of view, to understand as best as possible the knowledge, cultural dispositions, the perspectives, all of that they bring to the interaction. Are they similar to ours? And how are they different from ours? Because you might see a native English speaker talking to someone for whom English is not a first language, and they have a breakdown in communication. The first speaker might try to speak more slowly, as if the other person is stupid and not getting it, so they must simplify it so much that it almost comes across as offensive. But for everyone, when we have breakdowns in communication, maybe it's not about a difference in language proficiency. Maybe by understanding the difference between signifier and signified, that establishing alignment in interaction is all about speaking in ways that are familiar to the other person. And with that, it's very important to understand their culture, where they come from, and maybe not take it as our own, but to accept the things that are different from us.